Evelyn hadn't expected to be called into the study that evening. Her boss, Mr. Harris, had always kept a measured distance, his quiet demeanor and thoughtful gaze revealing little, even as they worked closely on countless projects over the years. But tonight something felt different. The entire day had passed in a flurry, with Evelyn managing last-minute details for an important presentation Mr. Harris would give tomorrow. He'd insisted on staying late to go over the final points, much to her surprise. The study was dimly lit, warm lamplight casting gentle shadows across the room, its old leather chairs and wall-to-wall bookshelves lending an atmosphere of quiet reverence. Mr. Harris was seated behind his desk, his gaze fixed on a document, his brows drawn in concentration. As she entered, he looked up, and his expression softened slightly, as though he'd been waiting for her arrival to ease some unspoken burden. "Evelyn, thank you for staying," he began, his tone carrying a gentleness that caught her off guard. "Of course, Mr. Harris. I know how important tomorrow is," she replied, her voice steady but her heart quickening. She'd always admired him, his wisdom and experience, the quiet way he commanded respect without demanding it. Though she'd never allow herself to admit it, his approval mattered more to her than she cared to acknowledge. Mr. Harris leaned back, observing her carefully, as though weighing his words. "You've been with the firm for a while now, and I've watched you grow into one of the most dedicated professionals I know." He paused, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that made her shift slightly, a warmth rising in her cheeks. "There's something I wanted to discuss with you, something I've been considering for some time now." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was as though they were both aware that whatever was about to be said would alter the unspoken understanding they'd shared for years. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice softer now, the concern genuine. A small, almost wistful smile played on his lips. Yes and no. He looked away for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "Evelyn, this might seem a bit unusual, but there's a reason I asked you here in my study. It's a place where I come to think, to consider things I'd rather not share elsewhere." He looked back at her, a flicker of something deeper, almost vulnerable, in his eyes. Evelyn waited, her heart beginning to race, a quiet anticipation building as she sensed that this moment was more than just a discussion about work. Evelyn nodded, steadying herself, sensing that whatever came next would require her full attention, perhaps even her understanding. She felt the weight of the moment, the subtle shift in the air, as though a line had been drawn only to be blurred by words yet unsaid. Mr. Harris took a slow breath, his gaze drifting over the room as if gathering his thoughts from the well-worn spines of the books that surrounded them. "You know, this firm has been my life's work," he began, his voice quieter now, a touch of melancholy woven through it. "But after so many years, there are moments I wonder if I've missed something, some greater purpose beyond the success and reputation I've built." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the confession. Mr. Harris was known for his unshakable dedication, the very foundation of the firm's success. To hear him speak of doubt was almost unthinkable. I hadn't realized you felt that way," she replied, her own voice almost a whisper. "You've always seemed so sure of everything." He smiled faintly, a hint of amusement softening the lines of his face. "We often assume certainty in others when, in reality, it's as fragile as our own." His eyes met hers again, this time with a depth that sent a shiver through her, a shared understanding that words alone couldn't capture. As she held his gaze, she sensed an invitation in it, not to answer but to listen, to understand beyond what he could bring himself to say. "I suppose I'm telling you this because I see something in you that I remember in myself years ago, that drive to prove yourself, to build something lasting," he continued, his words measured, deliberate. "But I would hate for you to look back someday and feel as I do now, wondering if there's more than the work that fills our days." The warmth in the room suddenly felt like a quiet intensity, an intimacy born not from romance but from an undeniable recognition between two souls, as if they stood on the brink of an uncharted territory that neither had intended to enter. "Evelyn," he hesitated, searching her expression, "I know this may sound unconventional, but I'd like to share something with you, something personal." He paused, as if waiting for her permission. Evelyn felt a surge of curiosity and perhaps a hint of apprehension, but above all, a sense of trust that pushed her to nod. I'm listening, she said softly, her voice almost lost in the silence that followed. He rose from his chair, crossing the room to a small cabinet. She watched as he unlocked it, carefully retrieving a small, worn leather-bound journal, its edges frayed from years of handling. He returned to his seat, setting the journal gently on the desk between them. This journal belonged to my father, he said, a note of reverence in his tone. He gave it to me just before he passed, and I've kept it here ever since. I never expected to share it with anyone, until now. Evelyn's breath caught as she looked at the journal, understanding that this was more than just an object. It was a piece of his past, a part of his identity that he'd kept hidden, preserved in the quiet sanctuary of his study. Would you, he hesitated, glancing at her with a vulnerability that was entirely new, would you read it with me? Evelyn's heart pounded, not out of fear, but from the depth of the trust he was offering. She nodded, her hand reaching forward, hovering over the worn leather cover before her fingers gently brushed against it. The silence between them grew heavier, charged with something unspoken yet palpable, as though in that small gesture they had crossed an invisible line. Evelyn felt a warmth bloom in her chest, a quiet but unmistakable understanding that whatever lay within those pages would change not only how she saw him, but perhaps how she saw herself. Evelyn carefully lifted the journal's cover, her fingers brushing over the first page, where an inscription in faded ink bore the name James Harris. 1948. The handwriting was elegant but unsteady, capturing a history she could only begin to imagine. She glanced up at Mr. Harris, who watched her intently, his gaze softened by a mixture of nostalgia and vulnerability. He cleared his throat, his voice low. My father wasn't a man who expressed himself easily. Most of his words, his thoughts, stayed locked away until he wrote this. I think maybe he wanted me to understand him in a way he couldn't articulate face to face. Evelyn nodded, feeling the weight of the journal as if it held not just memories but truths he had carried alone for far too long. She let her eyes drift back to the pages, beginning to read, her voice soft in the stillness of the room. October 12, 1956. Tonight, as I sit in my study, I find myself haunted by the choices I've made. I've built a life of purpose, yet, as I gaze into the quiet of these four walls, I wonder at the cost. I wonder what else I might have been if I'd allowed myself to deviate, to follow paths that once seemed too uncertain, too full of risk. Her voice trailed off, the words lingering in the air. She glanced up, finding Mr. Harris's expression unreadable, but his eyes held a certain vulnerability, as though the words had brought something long buried to the surface. When I read these words for the first time, he began quietly, I felt, as though I were reading my own thoughts. There's a strange comfort in realizing that someone else, even someone I admired so deeply, felt the same doubts and fears. Evelyn felt her heart ache with a strange blend of empathy and admiration. Here was a man who, for all his strength and success, carried the same unspoken uncertainties she herself had often felt but never voiced. She felt a connection with him that was deeper than admiration or respect. It was a kinship of unexpressed dreams and quiet doubts. I can understand that, she said softly. There are times I wonder if I'm on the right path, if the things I work so hard for will mean anything in the end. Mr. Harris looked at her, his gaze intense, as if her words had struck a chord. Evelyn, you have so much ahead of you. Don't let yourself be confined by expectations, whether they're mine, the firm's, or even your own. I wish someone had told me that when I was your age. She swallowed, feeling the depth of his sincerity, his words sinking into her with an almost profound resonance. It was strange the way a simple conversation could carry so much weight, so much meaning. They sat there in silence, the journal open between them, as though it were a bridge connecting them across time and experience. Evelyn could feel the unspoken tension between them, a magnetic pull that seemed to draw them closer, not just physically but emotionally. It was a connection that felt both natural and forbidden, hovering on the edge of something neither of them dared to name. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then, as though compelled by an unseen force, Mr. Harris reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the journal. His touch was warm, grounding, yet it sent a thrill through her that she couldn't deny. Thank you, Evelyn, he murmured, his voice barely audible, for listening, for understanding. Evelyn looked up, her gaze meeting his, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to suspend, leaving only the quiet understanding between them, unguarded and raw. She felt a tremor of anticipation of something deep and inevitable, as if she were standing on the brink of a decision that could change everything. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice barely a whisper, but he shook his head gently, his thumb brushing over her hand in a silent gesture of reassurance. "Call me Daniel," he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. The sound of his name, so personal and unadorned, sent a shiver through her, a reminder of the line they had just crossed, a line that once blurred could never be restored. Evelyn's breath caught, the air between them thickening as the weight of his words settled over her. The simple intimacy of calling him by his first name felt like an invitation into a part of his life she'd only glimpsed from a distance. She was no longer merely his assistant in this moment, she was a confidante, someone he trusted enough to reveal his hidden vulnerabilities. "Daniel," she said quietly, testing the name on her lips. It felt strange yet natural, like something she'd been meant to say all along. Her hand remained beneath his, warm and steady, and she could feel his pulse faintly through his fingertips, a subtle rhythm that matched her own. She was acutely aware of how close he was, of the soft shadows that played across his face, of the intensity in his eyes that seemed to draw her in deeper than she'd ever thought possible. He didn't pull away, and neither did she. They remained like that, caught in a silence that spoke volumes. Evelyn could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air, the shared understanding that went beyond words, something that had grown quietly between them over years of late nights' mutual respect and silent support. She realized then that she'd always felt this pull, this quiet admiration that went deeper than she'd ever allowed herself to acknowledge. Evelyn, his voice was barely a whisper, as though he too felt the gravity of what was happening, the way they were crossing an invisible boundary that could never be undone. His gaze held hers, steady and searching, as if asking for permission. Without a word she gave it, a barely perceptible nod that spoke more than words ever could. She didn't know where this would lead, but she knew that she trusted him completely, and that whatever was about to happen was something they both needed, a culmination of years of quiet understanding. He moved closer, his hand sliding up to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing over her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as she allowed herself to feel the warmth of his hand, the strength in his grip, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat resonating in the silence, each breath a shared rhythm. And then, with a quiet inevitability, his lips met hers, soft and unhurried, a gentle exploration that spoke of respect and restraint, of a desire that had been carefully guarded for so long. It was not a kiss born of impulse, but of something deeper, a connection that had been waiting to be acknowledged, to be brought into the light. Evelyn felt herself melting into him, the warmth of his embrace grounding her as his arms wrapped around her. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest, steady and strong, anchoring her in a moment that felt both surreal and profoundly real. She wasn't just kissing her boss, she was sharing a piece of herself, letting down walls she hadn't even realized were there. Their kiss deepened, a slow, tender exchange that seemed to erase everything else, leaving only the two of them, connected in a way that went beyond words. She could feel the years of unspoken emotions, the quiet longing that had built up between them, unfolding with each touch, each gentle caress. His hands moved to cradle her face, his touch reverent, as though she were something precious, something he cherished. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other as they took in what had just happened. Daniel's eyes were soft, his expression one of awe and vulnerability, as though he too was trying to comprehend the depth of what they'd just shared. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know where this will lead, but I know that I don't want to lose you. Not now, not ever." His words resonated within her, a quiet promise that felt as profound as it was terrifying. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the strength and warmth in his touch. She knew that whatever path they chose from here, it would be one they walked together, bound by a connection that had been waiting patiently in the shadows, waiting for them to finally acknowledge it. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. She could feel the unspoken promises in his embrace, the way he held her, as though she were something irreplaceable. She knew that this was only the beginning of something new, something that would require patience, trust, and courage to navigate. But as they stood together, she felt an unshakable certainty, a quiet confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that had been years in the making. They stayed there, wrapped in the gentle warmth of their connection, both of them reluctant to let go, as if releasing each other would shatter the delicate bond that had only just emerged. The room, with its dim lamplight and shelves lined with leather-bound books, seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, recognized the weight of the moment. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel reluctantly pulled back, his hand still resting on her shoulders as he searched her face, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made Evelyn's heart ache. "I never expected this," he admitted, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "But now that we're here, I can't imagine going back to the way things were." Evelyn felt her chest tighten at his words, a mixture of relief and fear swirling within her. She, too, couldn't imagine going back to stolen glances, to unspoken words, to the quiet ache of longing that had haunted her for so long. She knew that whatever lay ahead, they had crossed a line and there was no undoing it. Yet, in that realization, she found a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that this connection, this closeness was something worth holding on to, no matter the cost. "Neither can I," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet firm with conviction. Her hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture that felt as intimate as any embrace. They stood like that, hand in hand, their gazes locked, each silently promising to navigate whatever lay ahead together. Daniel let out a small sigh, his thumb tracing slow circles over the back of her hand. "I know this won't be easy," he said, his tone thoughtful, almost regretful. "There will be questions, consequences, but if you're willing, I am too." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I am," she said, her voice steady, carrying a quiet strength that surprised even her. She wasn't the same woman she'd been just moments ago. She felt braver, more certain, as though the simple act of choosing him, of choosing this, had unlocked a part of herself she hadn't known existed. They sat down together, still holding hands, as Daniel began to talk, sharing fragments of his life, his dreams and his fears, in a way he'd never done before. Evelyn listened intently, absorbing each word, each revelation, her heart swelling with a deep, abiding affection that transcended the physical. In return, she found herself opening up as well, revealing parts of herself she'd always kept hidden, her own doubts and insecurities, her dreams of making a difference in the world, of leaving behind something meaningful. With every word, every confession, she felt the distance between them shrinking, until they were no longer boss and assistant, but two people bound by a shared understanding, a shared vulnerability. Hours passed, yet it felt like mere minutes, the night deepening outside the window as they shared the kind of conversations that could only happen in the quiet, timeless cocoon of night. The walls of the study, once imposing and distant, now felt like a safe haven, a place where they could be their truest selves, free from judgment or expectation. Eventually, the quiet pull between them grew too strong to resist. Daniel leaned closer, his hand cupping her cheek once more as his lips brushed against hers in a kiss that was both tender and profound, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared, of everything they were on the verge of becoming. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back. They gave in to the moment, to the emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. Their connection, once tentative and unspoken, now felt powerful and real, as though it had been waiting patiently for them to finally take that step, to trust in what they had found. As the dawn began to break outside, casting a soft glow through the window, they sat together, their fingers intertwined, watching the first light of day illuminate the room. There was a quiet contentment in the air, a sense of peace that neither of them had expected but both of them cherished. "Whatever happens," Daniel murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that you mean more to me than I can put into words." Evelyn's heart swelled, and she squeezed his hand, her own voice trembling with feeling. I feel the same way. I never thought I'd never find something like this." They stayed like that, side by side, as the world began to stir around them, each lost in their thoughts, yet profoundly aware of the person beside them. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, entered a territory that was both terrifying and exhilarating. But for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt truly at peace, certain that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together.